Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I think we're just gonna jump right into things. I am Katy Corella, and I work at ArtsFund. I am the programs and advocacy manager. My pronouns are she, her, and I am joined today by Steffi, who I'm gonna let introduce herself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in this afternoon to learn a bit more about our research study. My name is Steffi Morrison. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the programs coordinator at ArtsFund. And yeah, Katie's gonna kick off our presentation.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your interest and your willingness to learn about ArtsFund's COVID cultural impact study. We we're based out of ArtsFund, which is a Seattle-based art service organization, and our mission is to support the arts through leadership, advocacy, and grant making in order to build a healthy and equitable and creative Washington. So ArtsFund has a long history with impact studies. We started economic impact study work in 1992 and have kind of continued on. And with the COVID cultural impact study, it's the first of its kind. It was something entirely new for us, but we really wanted to create something that was going to both serve as a benchmark for all of the impacts that nonprofit cultural organizations in Washington state had faced during this time, and would track those impacts for both organizations, but also for somebody's listening to some jazzy music. But wanted to track those impacts to cultural nonprofit organizations and the communities that they serve. And we really wanted to make this document available and accessible to all, advocates for the arts and culture, and so have created this document and are here to kind of present our findings with you today. So a little bit on the background. We started this in the spring of 2021 and wrapped data collection up in fall of 2021. And thank you to many of you who participated in either responding as a cultural participant or a nonprofit organization. We really appreciate your support and your time. But we used three main data sources. We used the nonprofit organizational survey, and we heard back from 212 organizations across the state of Washington, and you can kind of see where folks came from on the slide here. And we also heard from about 1,600 individuals. So those folks had either participated in an arts and cultural program since March 2020 or were residents of Washington state. So got a lot of really good information and wanted to kind of just go over some of those big findings. So the financial impacts were significant, as many of you know and are familiar with, across the organizations who did report their financial data. There was the first year alone about $100 million loss to total revenue. And this does not account for the full loss. Again, this was just from the reporting organizations who did share their financial data. So we know that, it's kind of a piece of the overall loss, but is a starting point for that number. We looked at the financial losses, the changes in attendance, the changes to contributed revenue and earned revenue across in different ways. So across regions, across organizational size, and you can kind of find more of that information on our website. So we, in kind of looking at these big losses, there was a bump to contributed revenue, and that came through pandemics relief support, both public and private and individual, and through counties, cities, the federal government. And that made up some of the gap for the earned revenue loss, but it's on the decline again, that contributed revenue. So with 47% of cultural participants saying that they want to continue participating online, and also anticipating spending half of what they had spent prior to the pandemic on their cultural spending. It's leaving a lot of organizations in a really, really on shaky financial ground. And it wasn't equitable. These impacts weren't equitable for organizations who identify as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color organizations. They had a large increase to their contributed revenue in year one of the pandemic, but it's back on the decline in year three. And in fact, the projected loss to their contributed revenue is putting them at lower, than pre-pandemic numbers. So a lot of inequities in funding around cultural nonprofit organizations. Another thing to note, though, was that pandemic relief was a lifeline for a lot of organizations. The top 3 relief programs that were accessed were public funding sources. We did notice, though, that access varied by organization size and locality. So different regions had, more access to city, county relief funds. So for example, King County, and then some of the organizations who responded from the Southwest region or the Eastern region had less access to those programs, so access fewer of these relief funds. And something to note about this is that some of the biggest relief funds, like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Shuttered Venues Operator Grant, those were the highest amount of relief dollars, but also a lot of the smaller organizations accessed those opportunities less than the larger organizations. So, that's kind of just something to note when thinking about these relief programs and what we're kind of looking for in the future. And of course, the impacts to revenues forced organizations to make really difficult financial decisions. So it impacted the cultural workforce, and those impacts have been really detrimental to that cultural workforce. So there was, a lot of cost saving strategies that organizations used, spending down operating reserves, closing facilities, but then also these furloughs and layoffs to full-time staff. About half of organizations did furlough staff or reduce hours or pay across their organizations. And what's important to note in these figures is that this doesn't take into account volunteers. And we know that organizations depend on volunteers. A lot of smaller organizations really rely on volunteers to, kind of help operate and really just kind of continue functioning. And what we found was that there was a loss of 8,000 volunteers in those reporting organizations. So really big losses across the sector. And that limited folks from applying to PPP if they were dependent on volunteer volunteer help to keep things running. So there's just this big concern around the cultural brain drain and rehiring cultural workers when folks are back up online. So those are kind of some of the main financial findings that we wanted to share with you today. I'm going to turn it over to Steffi to kind of share some more information around programming and public opinions and attitudes.
Thanks, Katie. The pandemic has, as we know, has ushered in this era of different ways to interact with cultural programming. We're all attending this right now virtually from likely our homes. It's the same thing for organizations. So 70% of the organizations that filled out our survey reported offering significantly more digital programming. And of that group, 3/4 of them believe that it's going to be permanent. However, it's the larger organizations that were more likely than the smaller ones to report these shifts, and they're more likely to report that they would be permanent. So as Katie mentioned before, at the time of the study, nearly half of the cultural participants indicated that they intended to continue their virtual participation, and that actually 16% preferred to continue their engagement remote only, for the foreseeable future, regardless if organizations were back to in-person programming. We also found, though, that this greater geographic reach and inclusivity for participants were commonly noted as this sort of silver linings from this shift to digital. Because, so this shift to virtual programming has increased accessibility for certain participants, including those with physical disabilities or impairments, transportation challenges, and just other barriers to leaving the home. And across the surveyed organizations, nearly a third had made accessibility improvements over the pandemic, and another 22% said that they had planned to. And then actually 84% of those making that shift intended to make it permanent. But moving towards equity in this realm, in the accessibility realm, will require continued investment and ample consideration moving forward. Because anecdotally, communities that lack reliable and affordable internet access, devices, or other technology literacy skills were much more likely to be isolated from cultural offerings over the past 2 years. So looking to the future, the near future, as we know, the future of any cultural organization is really contingent on staying relevant and connected to their communities. And we found through our cultural participant survey data that, the participants are still there despite many pandemic-related barriers. This slide here represents some of the reasons that our survey takers participated in cultural programming during the pandemic. So you can see the top ones are to experience art, of course. It made them happy, it brought them joy, and they really wanted to support a community organization or a program. And we also found that the future of arts and culture organizations looks to be much more networked with one another. 42% reported increases in activities that were conducted via local partnerships, and sort of a super high number, 94% of those felt like this was going to be a permanent shift. So these results indicate that organizations really see partnerships as central to rebuilding, and that this thinking includes partnerships across different sectors as well, so not only within the arts and culture sector. And so, the upheaval caused by the pandemic has made the essential role of arts and culture more expansive and urgent, but at the same time, providers that are providing these programs are feeling the most resource constrained and exhausted from, at this point, years of operating in limbo. According to the cultural participants that took our survey, they believe that nonprofit cultural organizations will play a very important role in post-pandemic recovery. For some of these reasons on the slide here, with the top one being economic recovery for businesses and organizations. People also see these organizations as creating employment for individuals. And almost a third of the participants in our statewide poll said that they value cultural programming more than they did prior to the pandemic. So with cultural participants placing more value on programming since the pandemic and the high level of importance that they place on these organizations in the role in recovery, this is like a really important opportunity to engage and support the sector as really a key player in near and long-term recovery. So ArtsFund, in the report, the way that we sort of built the recommendations was really to focus on 5 key areas. And we kind of broke it down by different stakeholder groups. So that included government and policymakers, cultural organizations themselves, the private funders, the corporate funders, individual participants, and then other partner sectors. The first of which is of our recommendations, is to reimagine the role of arts and culture in our communities. And so our recommendation is about centering the cultural sector in economic development strategies and to continue generating new audience research to learn more, to expand and sustain public support, which was so critical over the past 2 years. So we need to, continue to advocate for legislations that provide sustainable funding for the sector, and to direct investment in arts as a strategy for social impact. We need to protect the cultural workforce. So we suggest piloting models to increase cultural worker wages and wage stability, to expand employment definitions and eligibility criteria, and invest in services to make arts occupations more viable for more people. The fourth is to continue focus on equity. So by actively eliminating funding barriers and by helping to diminish this digital divide that we have. And then lastly is to continue supporting adaptation and survival. So this can be through providing unrestricted multi-year support, furthering access to technology, to continue supporting our public health initiatives, and then of course to participate and give. So with that, we can drop it in the chat. Our website there at the bottom, you can go there and you can download the full report and our executive summary, which is a bit easier to digest. And you can visit our website there. But with that, that's the end of our presentation. So we'd like to move into any questions that might have come up. And then if you think of something later or something, you can take down our email address, and that is the one that Katy and I respond to. So we will be, I believe Madeline will be sending out this PowerPoint presentation. So as well as a legislative one-pager that we have put together. So we want to, provide some materials for you all. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. Let's see.
So if anyone has questions, you can either drop them in the chat or you can come on screen and ask them. Either way, whatever works for you.
And I will say that there are definitely some opportunities to use this information and this material when you're taking meetings with legislators, if you're participating in Arts, Heritage, and Science Day. There's a few asks that are outlined in the briefing document that Inspire Washington put together, around some funding asks and cultural access, that legislation. There's also some bills related to broadband access, and so you can definitely take from this material what you feel really will help make the case for you, your community, your organization, and hopefully use some of these talking points in those conversations. Like Steffi mentioned, we developed a legislative one-pager with some of these talking points that we have been sharing out, and we'll definitely make available for you as well. Does anybody have any questions?
I've got one that I think we can use as a jumping off point for a conversation.
Great.
Where folks can pile on. Exactly what from the study do you find, because you've been doing meetings with representatives and senators recently yourself, has been the most effective thing to share with lawmakers from the CCIS?
Yeah, so as I kind of alluded to at the top, this loss of total revenue has been a really, really big talking point. Folks want to better understand what these losses have looked like for organizations. And while it is, again, kind of a small piece of the pie. We know that the loss is much greater. It's a jumping off point to really kind of put that $20 million and then $25 million ask kind of into perspective, that the total $45 million is maybe, it is but a small amount for the huge losses that these organizations experienced. Also, one really important thing to note, which Steffi talked about, has been just the key role that people anticipate arts and cultural organizations playing in their communities around economic recovery for businesses and other organizations, and also just helping to build back community unity and vitality. Hearing from individuals who really placed that value on cultural organizations and the work they do in their communities is a super powerful talking point that just goes to show that while there are, a lot of economic impacts that cultural organizations bring to their communities, there's so much more that they do in just building community and making spaces more vital, unifying folks who have felt so disconnected and isolated over the past 3 years. It's just pretty powerful.
I have a question. If there's not one coming in from the group, may I ask my question? Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Sidman. I am also with ArtsFund. So my question is not to Katy or Steffi, but it is to the rest of you attending this webinar. To the point that Katy just raised about the talking points, I'm curious, I think we have folks from different counties and different areas of the state on this call, and I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to share what region you're in. Does this data align with what you're experiencing? I mean, as Katy mentioned, we have disaggregated data by region in the report itself, but in the general trends, does it? And where are you finding it most useful to share this information? We are also meeting with Rotaries and chambers and business leaders and board members, but really curious what you're finding effective on the ground in your communities as well.
So if you want, you can go ahead and drop your answers to that question in the chat, or if there's anyone who wants to come on screen and share, that's fine too. I will just add that most of these folks have not met with their legislators yet. They're going to either today or later in the week. So, some of this is gathering information for that. But if any of you on this call have already met with one of your representatives or senator, and you want to share maybe what talking points were successful, that's great too.
Sorry, my question actually, and I will cede the floor again, I shouldn't have asked it, but was outside of legislators. Where else? Because where these recommendations in this data is critical for private funders, for existing donors, for volunteers and staff members.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying. That was my misunderstanding. But yeah, just go ahead and drop, even if you don't have specific folks that you've been speaking to outside of legislation, just drop your county, your city's experience in the chat. So Mary says, we're in Clark County, a nonprofit in its early days with the goal of building a children's museum. This children's museum in Portland closed during the pandemic, so that's a good example of what you've been talking about.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm from Edmonds. I'm the executive director of Edmonds Center for the Arts. We are Snohomish County. I just want to thank all of you for putting this together. This is a tremendous amount of work. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and just appreciate what you've done. We have not met with legislators yet, but we have had conversations with city and county level officials trying to make a case and help them understand the impacts, not just on our own organization, but across the board. This information being more global is really helpful to set context and to be able to provide us a stronger position from which to talk, not just about what has happened, but what we need to look for in the future and what we're dealing with in terms of reopening. So I don't have any specifics or anything different to say other than just to extend my appreciation to for your work, because I think it's going to mean the world to us as we go forward, trying to figure out how to get back on our feet and re-engage with the community. So thank you.
Great. And I just wanted to give you a heads up that we are hoping to make a presentation slide deck available. So if you're interested in kind of presenting any of these materials to your board or even folks at your own organization, we are hoping to kind of build some of those tools out for you so that it's easy to use and it's functional for you all who are, you know, so busy and dealing with so much. So stay tuned for those materials.
Awesome. I think we've got time for one more question. I know Marnie's got her hand up, and then I'll close out the webinar.
I am Marnie Rohrholm. I'm the Managing Director of Spokane Valley Summer Theater and soon to be the Spokane Valley Performing Arts Center. So not only are we managing a professional performing arts nonprofit, but we're in the middle of a capital campaign for arts building. And I will tell you that we are unusually one of the 20% in that is probably not going to pivot to keeping virtual platforms. It just circumstantially in 2021, when the governor opened the state, we were able to, can you hear me? Yes, yes.
Yes.
We were able to perform one show indoors last summer and it absolutely sold out. I think people are just so screen fatigued. And of course, performing arts lends itself to being in person. So we are probably not going to keep online platforms. We're going to push ahead with live in-person performing arts. The other thing I would say is I did do some testimony last week for the House bill on and Senate bill for Building for the Arts, which is awesome. And I that looks like it's succeeding at the moment. The only other thing I would say is I totally concur with your opinion that for us in the capital campaign, businesses and corporations totally underestimate the economic impact of the arts on recovery. And I do a bigger pitch on the economic impact on hospitality and tourism when I'm pitching than I do on the exciting things about the performing arts and this amazing multi-use performing arts facility we're building. That's what reaches people right now, and not necessarily the heart of the art, you know? So anyway, I'm blathering, but that was all I had to say.
And I'll just share that we were able to present to Representative Ryu, and she chairs the Economic Community and Development Committee and is hoping to get us on a work session there just to make those very points that you brought up, Marnie, because it's so tied to tourism, it's so tied to, you know, business districts, and really, really kind of continuing to show the ripple effects and how impactful they are just overall in more ways than on kind of individuals' well-being is something that we're definitely trying to make happen and trying to make folks understand when we kind of share these materials.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we are out of time, but I'm just going to drop a link in the chat to our YouTube channel where you can find all of the recordings of our previous webinars if you've missed them or would like to review the information. For those of you who are meeting with your representatives before or on February 3rd, I just want to urge you to really take a look at the House Bill 1058 webinar, because the 3rd is the cutoff date for that bill to be moved out of committee. And we're starting to worry that it's not going to get moved out of committee. And that would be really unfortunate. Thankfully, a lot of the other bills that we're championing, like Building for the Arts and the Senate bill for arts education, those are starting to look really good. So thank you guys so much for all of your hard work as advocates. You are helping to make that happen. So just really focus on House Bill 1058 if you've got a meeting coming up before the 3rd, and watch that webinar, because there's a lot of really great information about talking points and which particular senators and, well, not senators, it's a House bill, representatives are going to be the ones that you really need to hone in and focus on. We also have a webinar coming up tomorrow at 2 o'clock for the Senate bill on K through 12 arts education. So mark your calendars, and we've sent out the link in our newsletters for advocates, and you can also find it on our Facebook, our Twitter, and our Instagram. Great. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all.